Hello and welcome to another update. In this one I'll be covering the whole front line, and as usual the Kreminna area is the same as always, where fighting continues all the way from Makivka and down south to Sesberne with almost no changes to the front line. As for the southern parts between Avdiivka and Uledar, usual fighting continues. However, here there has actually been some changes, as the Russian forces have managed to advance slightly to the west of the H20 highway, west of Bakhmut, closing in on both the intersection as well as capturing a larger portion of the railways and closing in on Novokalinove, which is just slightly off. So essentially the Russian forces are on this part of the front line advancing slightly. And then we have the Bakhmut front updates, where we see here that the Russian forces have advanced slightly in the direction of Khomove. Earlier reports suggested that the Russian forces had entered, but so far it seems that according to Syriac maps, they haven't properly entered. They have come closer and advanced towards Khomove, but they haven't actually entered the village, and they're still fighting within the forest lines here to the north of the village. Fighting also continues here by the road. There has been some reports of Ukrainian reinforcements coming and pushing the Russians slightly back in these trenches. However, there's been no confirmed reports on this. There's been some video evidence, but that video evidence doesn't really tell that much, other than there's a lot of fighting within those trenches, both with drones dropping their grenades as well as soldiers advancing from both sides, and a lot of killing. And that is about all that has happened territorial change wise. Then we see a lot of fighting continuing within the city from the south to the north on the whole front line. There's just a lot of fighting within the city. The Russian forces are now fighting against the Ukrainians in heavily fortified positions, so most likely we will not see a lot of territorial changes in this part of the front line in the next couple of days, as the Russian forces would need to breach through these defensive positions which the Ukrainians have fortified, so it'll take a lot more time than usual. But at the same time we see the Russian forces continually bomb and shell these positions, so then again it might not take too long. And while we are on this topic, might as well go on to this presentation that I've prepared on the casualties of the war so far to this date. But before we get into it, we are now at 98,007 subscribers. We are only 1,993 subscribers from 100,000 subscribers. So make sure to help me out and hit that subscribe button. Thank you very much. Here is my take on the casualties of the Russo-Ukraine war. Let's just get straight into it. So first we have some different estimates of the casualties on the Russian side. So I've listed out the 5 prominent ones, where we have, these are all estimates, not the confirmed ones. So we have an estimate by alleged leaked FSB documents, which count 110,000 casualties. That was by the 28th of February. Then we have some US documentation claiming 223,000 casualties, which were the leaked documents that we all have heard so much about. Then we have a US estimate about 220,000 casualties by the 29th of March. So this is a bit confusing, because 223,000 casualties by the 1st of March reduced to 220,000 by the 29th, which could further indicate that the casualty numbers on the leaked documents have been manipulated. Then we have this estimate by Mediasona, which is about 234,000 casualties. So Mediasona could do confirmed kills on the Russian side. They have about 20,000 confirmed kills. So they essentially doubled their estimate based on their confirmed. So they are assuming that they've only confirmed half of the casualties. And then we have 181,000 killed according to the Ukrainian government. So those are the most prominent official estimates of Russian casualties. Then we have the estimates on the Ukrainian side, where we have one that I haven't graphed out because it's the Ukrainian government claiming 13,000 killed, which is an absurd notion, especially considering they had claimed about 10,000 killed by June. So in the first 3 months they took all the casualties, and in the next 6 months they took none. That doesn't make sense. Then we have the US and European officials estimate, which is 120,000 casualties, the Western estimate, which is 150,000 casualties, and US documentation, which claim 131,000 casualties. So these are the different estimates that are officially recognized by the West. So I have to look at these, and then I look and estimate based on what I think is the most reasonable. Then we have US and Mediasona estimates, which both rank around 220,000. Then we have the alleged FSB documents, which are at half of that, around 110,000. So that is something that I believe it is somewhere within this range, because if we look at the Mediasona confirmed kills, then that would be around the alleged FSB documents. So these two match. But then the estimate is double of that. And then we have the idea that Mediasona and the US are biased. They have an interest in providing a higher estimate rather than a lower one. So it is probably somewhere in between, but not to neither of these sides. Then we have the Ukrainian side, which based on US documentation is 131,000 casualties, which I still believe is an absurd notion. So if we take the first point that the Ukrainian officials claimed they had about 10,000 soldiers killed in the first 3 months of the war. If we take that as the basis, then in now over 12 months of war, that would be at least 40,000 killed. And that is lowballing it, because there's no one who would honestly tell you exactly how many they've lost. And considering the Russians have about 20,000 confirmed kills, then 13,000 is absolutely ridiculous. But I would estimate that they would probably put their own casualty numbers at half of what it should be. And at the same time, we've seen the Ukrainians actually launch offensives during these later periods, rather than at the start where they were purely on the defensive. And anyone watching the war could see that they had an advantage, compared to now where the Russians clearly have the advantage, and the Ukrainians have been on the offensive, which would cause more casualties than being on the defensive. And with the firepower advantage and so on, I've made some sort of logical estimate based on the documentation as well as the claims and so on, that at the very least, the Ukrainian casualties would be somewhere around 327,500. And how I calculate that was essentially, I took the casualty to death rate in the US documentation, which has 7.5 wounded to every one who was killed, which is, again, an absurd notion. The rule of thumb is 4 wounded for every 1 killed. And at the same time, that is when you have proper equipment to actually treat the wounded, which the Ukrainians do not have with the limited energy grid, as well as the different bombardments of the Ukrainian infrastructure by Russian forces. But then again, they do have some assistance from Western countries, but that again is limited and mostly used for the severely wounded. So based on that, I would put the casualty to wounded to killed ratio to be much lower, around 2.5 to 3, and putting 131,000 casualties, but with that rate 2.5 to 3, putting that as the estimate, then we would get somewhere around 50,000 killed. And then from that, we have to assume that there's many more casualties based on the fact that you can both get wounded and then return to fight and get wounded again. And at the same time, we do see the Western support and all of these things. So essentially, we have to double this number, 262,000 rather than 131,000. As I said earlier, the general rule of thumb is that you lowball it by cutting 50% from it. And then we have to put it with this casualty rate, which means somewhere around 327,000 based on that calculation. So what is my conclusion? The Russians have most likely somewhere around 150,000 casualties, of which 35,000 are either incapacitated or killed, which leaves a 1-to-4 kill-death ratio, which leaves a 1-to-4 killed to wounded ratio. And then we have the Ukrainian side, which is somewhere around 400,000 casualties, of which 100,000 are incapacitated or killed. And that is my estimate, that is my conclusion as to the casualties of this war to this date. And that is all for this update. Thank you for watching and have a great day.